Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
It took a lifetime to find the person you want to marry. Finding the perfect engagement ring is a lot easier. At BlueNile.com, you can find or design the ring you've always dreamed of with help from Blue Nile's jewelry experts who are on hand 24/7 to answer questions, and the ease and convenience of shopping online. For a limited time, get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com. That's $50 off with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name's John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Benjamin Halligan, who is Director of the Doctoral College of the University of Wolverhampton. And he has written several books, several studies, but today we're going to be focusing on Hotbeds of Licentiousness, the British glamour film, and the Permissive Society, which is an interesting area also because I sort of grew up in this period. And so I remember some of these figures very tangentially as sort of like almost from being parodied on TV. So, for instance, a big character in your book, Ben, is Mary Whitehouse.
Yeah, who was a figure of fun for the very people she despised, who were the metropolitan elites. You know, she put herself out as the kind of common sense housewife, every woman, moral majority, able to speak out against a rising tide of pornography and filth. She allied herself with the great and the good, Malcolm Muggeridge, perhaps great, not so good, Lord Longford, and indeed Margaret Thatcher. And in the book, I kind of track her disillusionment with Thatcher. As Thatcher got into power, she basically jettisoned Mary Whitehouse and her organization, which was the National Viewers and Listeners Association. Yeah, Mary Whitehouse was a kind of common figure in 70s and 80s TV, and as a censorious, killjoy Puritan, representing the kind of outrage that anybody cool and hip would be engaging in.
I remember she even had there was a comedy TV show named after her, the Mary Whitehouse Experience, and she was she sort of dressed like one of the Monty Python, when the Monty Python dressed in drag and did sort of takeoffs of handbag wielding sort of women of the local townsmen's guild or something. I can't remember quite what the name of that sketch was, but it's that sort of had that entire sort of makeup.
Absolutely. She wrote several volumes of autobiography. But the thing about Mary Whitehouse was she was spoiling for a fight. You know, she toured universities. She addressed sometimes occupied lecture theatres full of students. She seemed kind of fearless, and she wanted to confront the enemy. And she had a team of people who were with her, who were happy to, be part of that moral majority against the permissive society. So she was very much, I think, a self-promoting figure. And unfortunately, a lot of what she got up to now seems very problematic. And I know that in recent years, there's been an attempt to revive the reputation of Mary Whitehouse and say that for sure in the wake of the long 1960s, maybe things did get a bit out of hand and we've rode back on some of the freedoms of that moment. But I mean, here is somebody who worked with Jimmy Savile, who effectively whitewashed Jimmy Savile's reputation, even when she's on record in one of her books talking about what she understands to be the kind of lifestyle she wouldn't approve of. So she had an organization, and Jimmy Savile wasn't the only dodgy character to believe in it, that seemed unfortunately to operate as a bit of a cover. She picked the wrong fights. And the fights as well were not just writing letters to local newspapers to complain about teachers, rarely going to a board of governors at school, but just exerting external pressure. But she also engaged in kind of a form of spiritual warfare, tied up with conspiracy theory. She was convinced, for example, that the Soviet Union was flooding the UK with porn to weaken the manfolk, to allow for a Soviet land invasion with good British soldiers enfeebled by their addiction to Danish porn that they'd bought in Soho. So there was a sense of absolute lunacy in her positions. And I think if somebody had taken a more sensible stand, then, maybe something more could have been said that would have made more sense. But she also attacked allies, I mean, particularly in the Church of England, liberal clerics, liberal vicars, associated with what was called South Bank theology. She felt these people were very soft on liberal currents in society, and there should be a lot more kind of pulpit banging, Bible bashing condemnations. Many people like that. For example, John Gummer eventually converted to Catholicism. But generally, there was a little Englander mentality. And, she lived in Wolverhampton for a while. She was actually neighbours of Enoch Powell, would you believe? And she had this, regional sensibility that she wanted to take to the metropolitan elites to tell them what everybody really thinks. The legacy, I think her legacy is nothing in a way. And she must have known as well. And in her final writing, she kind of admits defeat. Satellite TV is around the corner. The people she allied herself with, such as Thatcher, didn't seem to be that bothered, didn't seem to care much. And in fact, many of her, entirely homophobic positions now are something you would look at and shake your head and think, thank God that's, in the past.
And yeah, I see what you mean, and there's a lot in this book where you're sort of thinking, wait until you see the internet as you go through it, and that's why I'm interested in this idea of specifically this being a moment when film is important to porn, and film that can't be for the most part can't be distributed and has to sort of appear either in a very geographically specific location in Soho, or via sort of mail order. And as you've also referred to, Denmark plays a crazily large part in this. It's like, bacon, butter, and porn, basically.
Yeah, and there was a theory that literally porn was being smuggled insides of Danish, in the insides of Danish bacon. I think Soho was conceptualized as a kind of bridgehead. This was where there would be a continental European invasion. And Soho was flooded with non-British, let's even say non-English stuff. Immigrants, even food. I mean, at the point when I talk about this, when Elizabeth David is trying to revolutionize British housewife cooking, talking about Italian ingredients, non-frozen meats, this stuff that you could get from Soho. And Soho was this mysterious liminal zone open to the influences of continental Europe. And from, a couple of hundred years before, it had been associated with vice. So in Soho, you have a kind of semi-autonomous zone, slightly unpoliced. You don't have a sense of English propriety. And in Soho, then you begin to have the influx of continental pornography. And when Mae Whitehouse visited Denmark, as she did for a television documentary, she kind of saw a future shock. This was what was going to happen to the UK. But in fact, the reality is it was kind of a marketing scheme of sorts. I mean, although censorship was abolished in Denmark around about 1970, and there was, and a renaissance in pornography with companies like Color Climax. In fact, a lot of the stuff that they were circulating was made in the UK, incredibly. Stuff shot in the UK to be shipped off to Denmark. It became uncertain where some of the stuff was in fact made. And in fact, Denmark was a kind of bugbear. I mean, what was behind that? I mean, a kind of Euroscepticism. And some of the people that were associated with May White House were then associated with anti-European political formations. A kind of, I guess, anti-socialism, maybe even anti-Catholicism, a fear of the masses and their political persuasions that were not allied to Protestantism, Tory Protestantism, a fear of the foreigner, different things, different ideas, different moral values. In this respect, the UK became, something that was endangered by continental Europe, was endangered by Soviet Russia, was endangered by trendy vicars, was endangered by academics and intellectuals. I mean, this list of targets of internal enemies is something that I think we recognize even now in a lot of political discourse on the right. The enemy at home needs to be brought to book.
Also, sort of anti-Semitism and racism, in the sense that there's one figure in particular that you name who is kind of like almost like a bridge between the upper classes and the sort of the National Front and more more extreme right-wing ideas. And we've already mentioned Enoch Powell, so living next to, I mean, I wonder what their garden party is like. I bet the streets ran with rivers of blood, rivers of Lambrusco, maybe.
Well, I can tell you, May Whitehouse disapproved of the vigor with which Powell kicked and hammered his apple tree to get the apples down.
Ah, right. Okay.
So we have that note.
That's the only, everything else of all the things to criticize Enoch Powell, mistreating trees was his ultimate sin.
But you're referring to the Dowager Lady Jane Birdwood. So this woman was a kind of aristocratic. I mean, I've got a feeling at one point she was kicked out of the British National Party for being too right wing. And on the 6th of October, 1971, she was involved in an event which was at Claxton Hall in Westminster, a meeting to protest against the showing to 600 children in London on Sunday, the 10th of October, of Dr. Cole's film Growing Up. And Growing Up was a sex education film, which itself had an enormous controversial history. And in fact, the Dowager Lady Birdwood, who had also complained, I think she'd stormed out of Oak Calcutta into the nearest police station and demanded the arrest of the cast and things like that, had, in speaking at this event and in her general writing, really said stuff that made my blood run cold. And, John, this was one of the hardest parts of the book for me, actually, writing this, because she'll have relatives who are still alive. And what I wanted to say would, I thought, cast quite a pallor over the memory perhaps they may have of her. She's long since dead. But I mean, very specifically, for example, she blames sex education for child sexual activity. And she talked about one case, and she referred to various clinicians who were with her on this, of a child who had talked about being sexually abused, and that this really, needed to be dismissed. The child was clearly fantasizing further to sex education lessons that they'd received in school and so forth. So to encounter her and her ideas now is really quite shocking. I mean, one would like to say she was a lunatic, but no, she wielded substantial power. She addressed substantial audiences. She was part of this discourse, which was also, simply racist, incredibly anti-Semitic as well. I'm not going to say it, but the stuff they used to promote these talks, drawing parallels with the Holocaust and,
yes,
a few dodgy sex education films were deeply offensive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Growing Up as a film that the British Film Institute have since released again, and it's an interestingly miserable film, and it does talk about the things that they were worried it talks about, and a teacher who was in it lost her job accordingly, and everybody in solitary sexual activity looks very miserable about it.
That seems to be something of a theme with the book, that there's quite a few moments in the book where you're sort of paying attention to what the people in the pornography. There are obvious moments where some of the people in the pornography are going, hang on, what's going on here?
Yeah, there are. And it's interesting as well because the feminists of the early 70s were quite split on this. I mean, on the one hand, there was a libertarian strain of people who felt that the suppression of sexual freedom, the hypocrisies around ensuring that sexual activity for women only happens within marriage, etc., is just an element of patriarchal society and to be smashed, and women must and should do what they want. So on the one hand, and you had this at various sex film festivals, there was approval. But on the other hand, when you looked at some of the films, for example, those of John Lindsay from the early 70s, you're looking at women who are distressed and do not look in a good situation. I was struck by the way that a fair few seem to be Irish as well. And I imagine there was quite a lot of interpenetration between sort of London prostitution circles and people who were in these particular films. And I wondered who they were, and I speculate in the book that perhaps they were escapees from Magdalene laundries. John Lindsay made a documentary about himself, and one of them addresses what she does very specifically in relation to the hypocrisies of religion, and sees her work as, you know, against that particular regime. But that's I kind of try and cut the whole filmography into two parts. I think on the one hand, there's the kind of idea of what I would call the value for money, or the value of money rather, what you can get for your money, which could include saunas in your stockbroker belt house, jacuzzis, models that feature in various top shelf magazines, a night out at the Raymond Review Bar that was kind of supposedly quite a classy disco-fied, let's say, gentleman's entertainment venue. On the one hand, therefore, you had this kind of aspiration that I associate too with the Joan Collins disco movies, The Bitch and The Stud, which are pretty much forgotten nowadays. On the other hand, you just have a sense of what can money get me. And many of the loops, the 8mm loops, just show very, very bluntly and in, you know, a massive detail coupling, often which is associated with Soho. So if you have money, this is what you can go and get. It's just a buyer's market. You know, one thinks of the 70s as a time of secular society, and, you know, the bachelor was a relatively new figure. And some of these people who I speculate would be the demographic that Margaret Thatcher would look to, who maybe had been school leavers, who weren't educated sufficiently to appreciate the middle class interests of wine and art and things like this, but had done well, maybe a slight wide boy tendency, had their wonga and wanted to know what society had to offer them as reward on a night out. So there's that kind of mentality that's firing all of this. As with the feminists, the Tory party was split as well. Jonathan Aitken wrote a book about swinging London. And on the one hand, there's the patrician element that is worried about all of this and would rather it stopped. But on the other hand, you have a libertarian element that sees this as the remaking of society, you know, crudity and wealth, overturning old institutions, overturning an Oxbridge stranglehold and reinvigorating in a neoliberal manner the British economy and its culture and creating a modern Britain. I don't think the Tories ever really worked this through, I would say. And the Permissive Society was a catalyst for thinking about these things.
I mean, there was a sense that this Soho material and this sort of hardcore material is sort of seeping into popular culture as well. Or is that the wrong way of looking at it? Was popular culture, were they just sort of parallel and they were dealing with sex and they were looking at sex in a different way and pushing towards being more, not necessarily more explicit, but also more candid, and that just happened at the same time? Or was there a sort of was there a cross-pollination between the two? Because you even mentioned like the Rolling Stones Beggar Banquet sort of inner sleeve and how it looks like the end of an orgy, and, you know, there's this sense that it's permeating, and even, you know, Beggar's Banquet has songs which are all about what today we would regard as paedophilia. Stray cat blues is like, I can see you're not 15 years old, but I don't want to see your ID. Something if you play, sometimes will play that to sort of someone of a younger generation, and they'll be absolutely appalled by the lyrics. So was there that sort of pollination? Was it happening like that, or was it sort of porn had a very small impact, and actually the mainstream was just on a parallel road anyway?
Well, that's an interesting question. I can't speak for him, but I'm sure if Samik was here, he would say that song was a character sketch of somebody he's condemnatory towards, rather than expression of his own particular feelings. Although there is, and I do explore this in the book, a certain strain of the eroticization, the arty eroticization of girls of a young age that I trace through to royal portraits and a number of photographers, society photographers of the 1970s. But on this permeation, yeah, there are interesting contact points. There are a number of figures who seem to do the rounds from the Benny Hill show, invariably as extras, to Are You Being Served, and then into loops, either of soft or a hardcore nature. Cozy Fanny Tutti indeed was, also I think across that circuit, but working with Coombe Transmissions as an art project. So yeah, there were connections, and popular culture reveled in the sense of naughtiness going on. And there's that film with No Sex Please We're British, which features Ronnie Corbett receiving by accident in the post a consignment of dodgy films and photos, and then spending the rest of the film trying to cover these up from his imminent mother-in-law. I can't remember the detail, but that was one of the techniques. You would randomly send catalogs or 8mm loops or photographs to various people with a note saying a friend of ours said that you may well be interested in this material. If so, you can contact us at this address and we can send you more. So there was unsolicited mail shot work was one way of promoting things. Okay, so with the Rolling Stones and Beggars Banquet, and I talk about a number of other albums, even Genesis Trespass, there was a sense of a kind of sexy society that was almost there, and maybe you weren't quite part of that, but if you took your copy of Beggars Banquet to a party, then it kind of indicated this is maybe where you were coming from. So around 68, you have this countercultural love-in explosion. And a lot of that was freighted with very strong ideological ideas of the ideological effectiveness and revolutionary import of free love. So the book explores that a bit, but it also tracks this into the suburbs in the 1970s, when the revolution, as it were, hadn't occurred. But you were left with a sense of freedoms, and perhaps various businessmen wanted their share of some of these. And there was a sense, therefore, that they were kind of missing out on stuff, that things were going on, things were accessible. They could access some of this if they had the money and put themselves in the right place at the right time. For me as a researcher, that threw up challenges because a lot of this material has vanished. Legal issues around it, people constantly being busted by the police corruption, which was very extensive, and took some years to be rooted out. People changing names. And indeed, the tax man was after quite a few of the makers of pornography. So at the point at which videos began to appear, a lot of people simply vanished because they didn't want to be traced back. So a lot of material only exists on celluloid. It never quite made the leap to digital. And it's difficult, therefore, to know, who was consuming some of this stuff. I mean, I know that, for example, some of it was being used at actual orgies. I know that with certain arrangements, you could have films made of yourself if you have various fetishes and various, for example, on the London callboy scene, there was a bit of that going as well. But a lot of this has, vanished into the ether. And as something of a film historian, it was very difficult to track what was going on. It was almost like, I guess, writing a film history book before the internet. You might have heard rumors of this, that, or the other. There might be some magazine or some book that mentions some film by some auteur that's never been seen in 50 years. There may be a copy in some archive somewhere. I mean, it really threw me back into that particular mindset. At the same time, these films are terrible. And if you're like yourself, John, if you're like a good film historian, you'll watch everything you can before putting pen to paper and writing about the work of somebody. For me, it was the opposite. I wanted to watch absolutely as little as I could. And then say, that's it, I've had enough of this, because it's all quite tedious and quite similar. So to watch emblematic amounts of ghastly 70s British sex comedies and then think, okay, we can draw conclusions. And if someone wants to call me out for missing something, I'll plead guilty, but I didn't want to watch another 25 hours of confessions of a plumber's mate's.
Well, I mean, that's something I wanted to get onto. I mean, so many questions coming up as you're speaking, but one of the things you start the book with is you say, so everything is kind of about class in Britain. You can't make a film without it being about class. You can't write a novel without it being about class. And there's a lot, D.H. Lawrence you mentioned. I love the thing about Joseph Conrad and the secret agent being like evidence of a pornographer in the, and there's amazing when you think about Get Carter and even Oh Lucky Man, the sequel to If that Lindsay Anderson does, you get these depictions of a sort of underworld version of what you're talking about, of the swinging parties and the exploitation of girls and some of these things that go on. But that idea of the suburbs being this place for that, and the swing parties and that kind of stuff. But there is also this sort of interclass thing going on, where we've already mentioned the stud and Joan Collins, where she has sex with her driver as a sort of last resort, as you mentioned. But also the confessions films, which are all about sort of, generally speaking, working class Robin Asquith, getting into all sorts of nucky with usually sort of lower middle class to middle class women.
Yeah, and one supports back to D.H. Lawrence, and in respect of these things, that there's a middle class perception that the lower classes, the working classes, or maybe in a kind of continental European way, the peasant classes, uninhibited, closer to the earth, free to do what they want, don't worry about scandal. And in D.H. Lawrence, particularly Lady Chatterley's Lover, you actually have the creation of this particular myth, or the fusion of it into a particularly forward-looking novel that, of course, was banned. Of course, its unbanning became one of the great signals at the beginning of the swinging 60s for Philip Larkin, the poet, as well as many other people. So what interested me was something that my late friend John Hevin said, which was that all British cinema is about class. And I begin with a discussion of that famously buttoned up film, Brief Encounter. And I wondered what the antithesis to Brief Encounter could be, or was. This affair that's a non-affair, the boredom of this woman who indeed lives in a London suburb, thinking about the post-World War II world and what waits for her, what kind of life she would have, which was a life starved of romanticism and starved of characters like Trevor Howard, the dashing doctor. So at what point do the floodgates open, getting Mary Whitehouse's feet very wet in the process, to allow this great yearning for something else, for hedonism, to occur? So class, in a way, becomes the operative vector through which fantasy begins to manifest itself. I mentioned, the confessions of films, and you mentioned Robin Asquith. And a lot of this is a kind of 1970s style imagining of what the working class gets up to. They should be fitting your plumbing, but in fact, they're getting flirty with your neighbor, or, things like this. There was something about that which was very typical of 1970s, political discourse. But class as well also represents the kind of way to move up in society and down in society too. And in moving up and in moving down, you begin to lose touch with your background and with your class. So towards the end of the book, I revisit the idea of the scholarship boy, Richard Hoggett's notion of the child who has done well academically, sort of better than perhaps would have been expected, and has gone on to greater things, but in so doing has lost touch with his roots, with his class, not really necessarily at home with the strata in which he finds himself. But when he goes back at the weekend to see old friends, downing pints and one, he's not like that either. And there's a profound alienation that, begins to occur. And I think that alienation is played out as I explore it in the final section of the book, in respect of the sexualization of the lower classes, or this strain of council estate porn that was kicking around 10, 15 years ago. I wanted at the very end to kind of close the book on the 70s. This was at the point of the dawn of video, which shut down all the sex cinemas, the point of AIDS, which shut down a lot of open permissiveness, the point of Thatcher coming to power, which shut down a lot of the pornographic underground. And then cut forward in the future, and I drew a parallel to The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Mae Whitehouse has died. The structures of the British Board of Film Classification are slightly over. And look at what you actually get when you can do what you wanted. And to my amazement, I found that even in this semi-utopian state, class is still structuring queer gay pornography. Somebody comes from the council, they want the overdue council tax from some lads who live on a council estate, they're pulled in, mayhem ensues. And this is the fantasy that maybe I thought was being sold back to that scholarship boy and his feelings of alienation. That the yearning for his particular class background becomes a kind of lusting for his particular class background as well.
That's sort of interesting, because that parallels it with the Lady Chatterleys and the nostalgia for the mud and the nostalgia for the soil, as you point out at one point. And it's also interesting, I think, that the 70s was so full of, like, when you look at all the scenarios that you talk about in terms of those loops and in terms of those stories, they're all kind of Victorian anyway. So on one side, the anti-permissive society people want Victorian values to return. And on the other side, the pornographers want Victorian. They want chambermaids and school mistresses and spanking, and the fact that when the Great Exhibition was held in Crystal Palace, they had a separate brochure for the gentlemen for all the brothels in London could be a guidebook, if you like. So it's kind of the two keep bouncing off each other, and even though they seem to be antagonistic, they seem to also define each other very, very clearly, or mirror each other very clearly.
Yeah, I wonder if that's some of the roots of BDSM, which was at times referred to as the British vice, and that does
by the French.
By the French, yeah.
We give them kissing, they give us spanking back.
Well, the master of this, and perhaps one of the main figures in the book, was Harrison Marks.
Right.
And Marks began in the 50s shooting kind of cheesecake nude photographs in his studio in Soho to be sold in newsagents. A studio, by the way, which featured in Michael Powell's film Peeping Tom, to which Marks contributed, and then began making loops. At the same time as hitting the bottle. And I think by the late 70s, you hear stories that he was sort of slumped in the corner and the performers just got on with what they'd been hired to do. But was interested in two things. One was interested in breaking relationships out of monogamy. He thought this was the way of the future. And he was specifically interested in people borrowing the 8mm, 16mm projector from their factory, taking it home for the weekend, and then hiring a couple of Harrison Marks films to watch with their partner to suggest that maybe they should invite other people into the relationship. But he seemed to truly believe that this was, this was the way forward. This was the sexual revolution. But the other thing was, I guess, BDSM. And at the point of video, he shot very long videos with often quite old people playing headmasters. So stuff from maybe the early 80s with people who look like they were in their 70s, even older. And I thought, well, where have these people come from? That perhaps belong to a certain subculture of the 1920s and the 1930s that you get kind of hints of, in the life of people like Francis Bacon, for example, Lytton Strachey. But somehow they're pulled out of retirement to play a headmaster, telling off a kind of Victorian style school teacher, which leads to kind of spanking and things like this, and complaints and more spanking and so forth. And then Marx, reputedly, I don't know if this is true, ended his days kind of drunkenly comparing live spanking shows in Soho basements, some of which seem to have been videoed and were then on the circuit of the things you could buy from Soho pawn shops. So perhaps this thing about punishment, this theme of punishment, goes back to that Victorian notion of the right and the wrong and transgressing and what happened to you. But of course, Margaret Thatcher talked of Victorian values, and this was one of the great rallying cries as the Tory party sought power, that they would return Victorian values. They would weed out trendy teachers. They would get rid of the terrible legacy of the late 1960s.
Bring back the cane.
Bring back the cane. Rhodes Boyson, who was one of our education ministers, was terribly keen on.
I got caned as a boy.
Well, me too. And in fact, I reflect on that. I got caned with somebody who's quite a celebrity now.
Who?
Well, I'm not. Do you know what? I'm not going to say. We were caned together, and he talks about it in his book and mentions me, and I talk about it in my book and mention him. I'm going to leave that for the reader to find out. He was more annoyed about it than I was.
Right.
Although I think he probably deserved it more than I did. But Rhodes Boyson said that in removing caning, you severed the emotional bond between the teacher and the pupil.
What a remarkable thing to say.
Yeah, simply incredible.
Because why should the teacher have an emotional bond of that type anyway? I mean, this is one thing I'd like to sort of go into a little bit, because I think pornography and okay, I'll just sort of give you a sort of my view and then see what comes of it. So movies kind of posit a certain kind of universe, and you go into that universe and you live in that universe, and they give you kind of values by which to judge the film itself, and which by implication you feel morally this is right, this is wrong, whatever. Pornography kind of does that as well. It kind of gives you a view of a universe where, say, everybody wants to have sex, or everybody doesn't want to have sex but can be very easily triggered into having sex, or something like that. But so it's analogous to non-pornographic films in that sense. However, normal films, you never watch. I very rarely watch a film, maybe extreme horror, but I very rarely watch a film and think, how did they get people to do this? Or how are people in the world? And this goes just to what your comment of sort of like, how did they get, a 70-year-old to come in and agree to being a spanking video? That sort of seems to be something which is very much inside some of these films as well, of like, this actually happens. This is actually, and this can come from a very early age, where maybe for a lot of people, a lot of kids, it might be the first time they see adult nudity, for instance. So it's like revelatory on several different levels, and not simply sort of like, oh, this is it's in that sense, it's different from watching a non-pornographic movie. Is that, I don't know if that's an idea that's interesting or not.
I think you put your finger on a very contemporary idea, which is that these cultural dregs actually evidence sociological material of a very important matter. And there has been quite an explosion in writing on US pornography in the golden age of porn, and particularly in terms of gay queer stuff. And I was very happy to, in a very modest way, contribute a little bit to that in writing about Fred Halstead and LA Plays Itself. So that when you encounter these films that are pre-AIDS, and they include sexual practices that perhaps would now be viewed as dangerous and probably wouldn't appear in films, what you're actually seeing are insights into a certain society that's gone, and the way that that society had a utopian ideal of life and of living that represented a post-1968 political project that also has gone. So in a lot of US writing on pornography, you have this deeply engaging sense of the exploration of forgotten communities, of subcultures, of what was lost, which itself has caused trouble for the academy in the sense that, if somebody dies and they gift a box of old videotapes and magazines to a university library, what are they meant to do with them? They probably won't spend money looking after them, restoring them, rather than, some sheath of notes from T.S. Eliot or something like this. So the material itself raises interesting academic problems. In the UK, that hasn't really occurred. Part of, I think, the inspiration for me in terms of writing this book was to try and do something similar, to say, what do these films tell us about a certain time and a certain place and the structuring and fantasies of that moment? But I was slightly overwhelmed by the idea of class. This seemed to be, bursting out of the screen at all points. That there was never really a kind of pure documented sexuality. It was always, there was just too much messing around. There was too much comedy. There was, too much of the real world that was sort of seeping in from the outside. I developed, therefore, a methodological model, a critical way of thinking about pornography that I thought would help me through. And I had this idea that, any advertising person would tell you that if you watch a TV advert for a car, they're not selling you so much the car, they're selling you the lifestyle that's associated with that car. So, some ghastly Fiat Punto, people in the back, tennis picnics, weekends away, stuff like that. So they're selling basically a form of freedom.
I've got a Fiat Punto.
So you can testify that this.
Yeah, very very few picnics in my experience, unfortunately. Sorry, I interrupted your point.
So that artifact is selling you a certain lifestyle, but with pornography, it seems that we need to take one further step back, because in a way we know the lifestyle is a nonsense. We know if you buy that car, as you said, John, you won't be in picnics with glamorous people. You'll just be tootling from A to B in one traffic jam after another. And in fact, therefore, this fantasy of the freedom that you're buying speaks more of what the filmmakers, or even the film itself, imagines that the viewer wants. But, and this is the third step, what the viewer wants itself is kind of aspiration.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
So you have the imagination of the film, imagining the imagination of this unseen, unknown viewer. You have fantasy upon fantasy, as it were. So what you have then, when you look at the pornographic film, is a kind of arena of aspiration and fantasy and what I would like or what somebody else thinks I would like and how that plays out. And in a way, therefore, kind of reward, for the secular society, for the bachelor, for someone who's done well, someone who's made a bit of money, what society owes that person. This, to me, is a very, very deep insight, a very deep sociological insight. And the reason I wanted to push this into the 70s is because it begins to account for why people voted for the Conservative Party at that point. It begins to account for the breaking of the post-war consensus. It begins to account for this figure of the floating voter who perhaps no longer would, vote for a socialist party like their parents, but wanted more. Even those Joan Collins disco films say something about new metropolitan centers, new forms of pleasure. And these ideas, in a way, begin to structure how we dress, how we think, who we are, what we do, how we spend our money. There was a tie-in with Joan Collins films with the LP tracks. There was a tie-in aftershave called Monsieur Le Stud. If you wore this aftershave, like one of the characters, you could go to a disco and you could pull these exotic models that you find there. Some of the stuff, and you mentioned Joan Collins in that film as a disco owner in furs and a Rolls Royce, no underwear. Some of these ideas were still being recycled in the gutter press about, for example, Princess Diana in the months before she died. This was kind of the imagining of the wealthy and those that you would aspire to in terms of what they got up to and what their lifestyles were. So you have a kind of hidden sexual life of British post-war society. And pornography allows that. And that's why, if you'll forgive me, there's quite a bit at the start of the book laying into other historians of British cinema and their failures to deal with this. Often unstated, they simply won't go there. I mean, the films, I admit, are pretty ghastly, but at the same time, they made quite a lot of money. And as much as you could spend a lot of time talking about representations of various characters and so forth, there's something going on here that no one else wanted to touch. So I was really happy to get the first full, substantial book out on this. And I just, at that point, as a final note, I really want to have a shout out to my friend Oliver Carter, who published a book the year after mine came out in 2023 called Under the Counter: Britain's Trade in Hardcore Pornographic 8mm Films. And Oliver really did do the deep dive. Whereas I was slightly running away from this material, as I've mentioned, Oliver pieced stuff together like a detective. Even looking at the designs of typefaces on 8mm boxes, working out which companies were distributing which films, where they were coming from. So Under the Counter really is a fantastic history, financial history as well, at that particular moment.
I mean, there's going to be, I think that reticence from film historians about this era is going to make it much more difficult for us to look at the era we're living in at the moment. And I don't just mean, I mean, I've just today I watched Megan, and there's a reference to somebody says in a casual line, "Were you porn hubbing in the office again, Roderick," or whatever the character's name is. So there's this mainstream, and there's a new Netflix TV series where you have full frontal male nudity, which is on the streaming service. The new Menendez series is the one I'm referring to, but I'm sure there's many others that you can get. So it just appears that this reticence and sort of prudishness about looking at the pornography as is related to visual media generally doesn't put us in a good historical situation in terms of looking at it now, when it is in many ways vastly more integrated into our culture.
Yeah, so my book hoped to ignite that argument and to energize people who wanted to maybe follow this through a bit more and to expand the boundaries, the paradigms of talking about popular culture, and see what porn has to offer to that. I mean, perhaps it's beginning to happen a bit. There was a recent conference at the University of Warwick on carry-on films. So, things begin to change. I mean, a while ago, I wrote a book on Michael Reeves, who made Witch Finder General and The Sorcerers. And when that book came out, Reeves was just this pretty good genre horror filmmaker, died in 1969, didn't make very much, And since then, the films have become classics, and they've been released and re-released, and they've gone from being shown after midnight on Channel 4 to kind of like 10 p.m. horror classic BBC Two. So you can see reputations begin to change and ideas begin to change. Unfortunately, whereas Reeves's films are great, there's very little in my book.
That was kind of my next question was, is there anything that is, BFI season worthy?
I don't. I I suspect the BFI would answer no. I think there could be something to be said for showing some of the more commercial House and Marks films, which included musical elements. There are some non-carry-on films like Rosie Dixon Night Nurse, which I'm sure still exist in ragged 35mm prints that could have a bit of an airing, perhaps. Some of that stuff is of interest. Some of it's quite funny. Some of it obviously has sociological value. Um, but there's not too much. I think people, think about carry-on films as the entirety of it, and that really isn't the case. I mean, carry-on films were the most respectable angle on all of this, and underneath that was this, the rest of the iceberg was vast, and carry-on films now almost is the only thing that remains. But at the same time, they had humor, they had a lot of comedy, they had a lot of slapstick, and we find that too in all of the films that that I'm talking about.
Well,
British people don't seem to take sex very seriously, do they?
yeah, well, I mean, that was one of the things that we talked about sort of before we started taping. It's so difficult to sort of have a serious conversation about something like this without sort of fanaring or resorting to double entendre. One of the things that you mentioned, but I think we're doing okay. I think we're doing pretty well. One of the things you mentioned earlier that I wanted to come back to is the idea of transgressiveness, which I think is another thing of which to some degree links porn to horror as well. The idea of extremes and almost unpleasant watching experiences being part of it. You talk about the film or a collection of films which was variously titled Animal Farm, and how these which from its title you might be able to guess involved scenes of bestiality, and there were and there's also you also talk about the various sort of pedophile films which are which were out and which were circulating as well. These sort of extremes and these sort of extremes transgressions seem to be almost disproportionately there in porn, in the sense that you get the feeling that that once you've stepped over, if you put pornography out of bounds, then it's very quick to go into transgressive material because you're already transgressing by just watching it anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned two areas there that were that would now be considered to be absolutely transgressive. Let me deal with each in turn. Animal Farm was a kind of bootleg videotape that circulated.
I remember hearing about it at school. I as a sort of urban legend, as and what happens, and not being able to even conceptualize it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it seemed to be in circulation in Soho in the early days of home video recorders players. So straight away you had something that you could use at a ghastly teenage party as a gross out test for you and your mates. Can you watch this? And it had a sort of legendary status. But in fact, as I understand it, because I haven't seen it nor would I want to, Animal Farm consisted of bits and pieces of the film work of Bodil Joensen, who was a Danish actress, model, and I guess you would say farmer as well. And she featured in an art documentary called Bodil Joensen, A Summer's Day, July 1970, which was on at a few sex film festivals. And I saw, 10 years ago in Trieste at Illimilocci. This film's a documentary about her, and she, well, it's a very tragic story, but she basically ran a farm to extract sperm from various animals, which is just, standard farming practice around breeding and so forth. But she did this because she had retreated from mankind. She had suffered sexual violence. She'd been raped. The only relationships she had after a very religious upbringing were with animals. So her role in doing this was to be part of a kind of sexual encounter with animals to stimulate them in order to gain sperm. And then as she ran out of luck, some of this was, filmed, some of this was released. The film A Summer's Day itself, is a very serious documentary that posits this as it were, the far edge of green ecological sensibility. What it truly means to live on the land, to live at one with nature. And this is the point at which I think most people would slam the doors and put the central heating on and think this is too far. So the film sought to explore this very far utopian position relating, I think, to 1968. She herself lost her farm. It was shut down by the authorities. Other people stopped doing business with her. They were suspicious of what was going on there. She became a drug addict. She became a prostitute, and she died at a relatively young age. But elements of the films that were made when she was down on her luck then, reappeared in Animal Farm. So this was underground, and if you were caught with this stuff, you would, be arrested. The other transgressive thing you mentioned is completely overground, and it remains that way. And these are the films of David Hamilton. And I have a chapter on David Hamilton. All of these films were certified by the British Board of Film Classification. Some were not even given, they weren't even given 18 or X certificates. They were given kind of, middle of the road certificates. And David Hamilton, who killed himself a couple of years back after various accusations were made against him, engaged in a kind of Victorian-style eroticization of young girls. And Bilitis is the film that I think is most remembered for. And it's like an arty, erotic revelry that was on in quite respectable cinemas. He made films across the 70s and across the 80s. And he was a photographer as well. And his books, I think now it's fair to say, have been removed from libraries, even university library collections. And David Hamilton really eroticized in a way that I think exerted influence. I mean, I talk about the famous photo of the woman scratching her behind on the tennis court, which was in every kind of student bedroom in the 70s and 80s. Various royal photographers who were using this kind of Laura Ashley style sunlit imagery for portraits of Charles and Diana. That David Hamilton was churning out a kind of aesthetic for the 70s into the 80s. But when you look at his films now, which are all legally available, you're kind of shocked and appalled and horrified. And I think he's probably best forgotten, and conceivably he escaped justice as well through suicide. So what is interesting to me is that what seems transgressive exists within the mainstream.
It's kind of interesting as well that there are a whole bunch of films that you mention in the 60s and 70s, which are sort of billed as like May to December romances, but are, looking at them today, they're like with a schoolgirl and with it's Susan. Was it Susan George? Was in one, and there was another one. I mean, Clint Eastwood did one called Breezy, which was about two. I think she's an adult. I'm pretty sure she's an adult, but huge age gaps.
Yeah.
But I mean, the one for Susan George, which I
that
forget.
was Lola or Twinkie.
Twinkie,
Richard
yes.
Donner, yeah.
Yeah. And Richard Donner, exactly. The sort of, these were respectable filmmakers, and the concept of them. I mean, I remember the poster for that one is sort of like she's almost 16 or something. It was outrageous now, but then, I mean, I guess it's that people don't remember, or maybe have forgotten the page-free culture of where it was always predicated on she's just finished her O levels, or she'll be out in the world soon, boys.
Yeah, and there were some others as well. I mean, Jenny Agutter in Walkabout, Helen Mirren, Age of Consent, Natasha Kinski into The Devil a Daughter, Picnic at Hanging Rock, Baby Love with Linda Hayden. Yeah, so this strain of May to December films. As with May Whitehouse, what the area of argument was the sexualization of children.
Right.
That often, in terms of arguing for the banning of a film, for example, as Jimmy Savile famously did, attacking A Clockwork Orange and things like that. It's the protection of the innocence of children. So there was a sense that children have an autonomy, come into their own, become sexualized, and then the adult world doesn't know how to deal with these things. So some of these films look at the ways in which the adult world gets sucked into that. But I think, John, for you and we would quite correctly, I think, look at that as terribly exploitative in terms of such a relationship dynamic. But it was quite the other way around in a way at that point. There was a documentary I talk about, which was Johnny Go Home, that was about, well, among other things, it was about the kind of male cowboy scene in the 70s around London Euston. And it's a very important documentary, and it became very difficult to see, and a number of arrests followed further to the investigation of that documentary. But at that point, what was being posited was that respectable businessmen were being led astray by these super sexualized male cowboys or super sexualized young females, and it was the family unit that was being endangered by Swedish au pairs that were coming in to look after your kids and things like that. So those figures we would identify as the exploiters were in fact the people that were endangered by this new sexual culture. That was certainly, a strain of filmmaking that we don't have anymore. Let's put it that way. Nonetheless, those concerns about sexualization of children or young adults very much remain. It was also one of the main points of argument of the paedophile information exchange. So you had a number of pressure groups in the 1970s growing out of a kind of 1960s sexual liberation project. And this was another bugbear of Mae Whitehouse, by the way, that read society's strictures as shutting down forms of expression of children, and that these could be overcome, could be opened up, that we should recognize childhood sexuality. So that the paedophile information exchange was a group that sought to lower the age of consent, and a group whose activities now long since gone, but whose activities now remain a point of contention, and featured fairly heavily in the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. A number of the reports of which I've used in putting this book together. So this question of childhood sexuality was very much there in the 1970s.
Yeah, it also strikes me that has seeped into sort of publicity and advertising as well, where you're often confronted with pictures of models who are very close to the age of consent, if not below, and yet the atmosphere that they're projecting is one of confidence and utter immunity and utter power. Women, I mean girls, and you're sort of thinking that is fairly inversely proportionate to what power they actually have in society in terms of sexual power. They're projecting this power, and yet they're very frequently the people who will most likely be victims of sexual abuse, most likely be victims of sexual assault, etc. So it sort of gives off this idea that, oh, we've got the femme fatale and we've got the powerful female figure, and thank heaven we have lots of powerful women around, but that it's almost like the man bites dog. It's the thing which is the opposite that is the thing which is the most advertised in our culture.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just as I followed the class element back to D.H. Lawrence, I wanted to follow this element back to, I guess, Victorian poetry and the Uranian school of poetry, which was fairly ghastly. It was often, very sexually frustrated vicars writing poems to their favorite choir boy. And there's quite a debate as to whether this is simply a kind of displaced pedophilic yearning that sort of is harmless, where the Sicilian fisher boy is considered as at one with nature, that the beauty of the male form, something we should celebrate, etc.
Thaddeus.
Yeah, or whether it was a lot more, pernicious. And so this strain has been present in British literature since the sort of 1860s, 1870s. Then right the way through, 100 years later, it reemerges. But the Uranians, and I would include Gerald Manley Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet, among them, also considered things in specifically Judeo-Christian terms, and the notion of saving the beauty and preserving the innocence through a kind of patriarchal possession of this beauty. I mean, some of that seems familiar to us from May Whitehouse, Lord Longford. We must preserve the innocence from the corruption, but some of it at the same time seems the methods of operation of grooming. And you have in that then a complete mess of material. I mean, the one thing I will say is that the films that we mentioned just now were all mainstream films with quite notable actors in. And it was those films that seemed to me to be dealing with these matters, whereas actual pornography very rarely sexualized schoolgirls. I mean, John Lindsay did and kept winding up in court for it. Court cases he won. But very evidently, somebody with a hockey stick and a boater who was a model in her 30s was not what the 8mm loop cardboard packet claimed it was going to be. The models and the performers, I think, of the 1970s, in terms of accessibility, were often not only older, but substantially older. People whose autonomy, and I think this is why there was a libertarian section of feminists that approved of this, people who had the age and the experience and the autonomy to choose and do what they wanted, I think was the operating assumption. I'm not saying I agree with that, behind their appearance in a lot of those films.
Last point I wanted to ask you about, is you've mentioned already the sort of council house porn, and we talked slightly obliquely about the sort of the gay porn that's coming out of this period as well. And so I wanted to sort of dedicate some time to that, because it strikes me as an area of porn which is not as conflicted as, say, the feminists of the 70s were very uncomfortable in being anti-porn but aligning themselves with Mary Whitehouse, or pro-porn but potentially aligning themselves with exploitation. Whereas gay porn feels much more, not that it doesn't have difficulties, but that there is you can go for it if you'll allow that expression, and feel that actually, no, this is a form of liberation.
Yeah. So I asked myself the question, when did pornography, in the sense of stuff that was like simply presented for eroticized titillation and arousal, when did we first see that in the UK? And I can't answer that question. I don't know. Oliver Carter comes up with an interesting rumor that it was a side hustle for people working in the GPO film unit. So when they weren't shooting night mail, they were doing stuff on the side. I'm sorry I heard that story, because I love the GPO films. And likewise, when did gay porn first turn up in the UK, i.e. shot made in the UK? It's difficult to answer. There was somebody called Mike Freeman who was shooting stuff like What a Gay Day in the late 1970s, and was a mysterious, controversial figure, dead now. He was born Mick Muldoon, spent some time in prison for murdering his minder. The body was dumped in Epping Forest in Essex. Even mad Frankie Fraser was sort of horrified at the brutality of this murder. And then when Mick Muldoon got out, became Mike Freeman, he began working on U-matic video, and he found the Videx company. This was during the phase when the British Board of Film Classification didn't censor videos because they thought it was a minority interest. It wasn't worth taking, So pretty much anything you want could come out. So he was shooting on video. Often the quality was abysmal. And he was releasing gay porn. And What a Gay Day follows the standard template. Some bloke turns up to repair a radiator, and in next to no time there were three guys including the repairman, although I assume he's not a real repairman, going for it on a shag pile carpet. And in a way, this is fairly revolutionary stuff in the late 1970s, if you consider the situation of gay culture at that moment. Beyond that, and this is really why I wanted to kind of skip forward, you needed a moment of unapologetic gay porn to begin to understand what was going on. And I was wary that my book was very heterosexual, because the nature of the material was heterosexual, was basically talking about male filmmakers. So I couldn't diversify. It was also very white. And I speculate intersectionally that for someone who was black to be involved in this would have been a double jeopardy in terms of arrest and scandal and exposure. Maybe that would explain it. So that's why, towards the end, I wanted to skip ahead and to look at a more free-for-all moment in terms of gay porn. I mean, again, there's been that undercurrent, isn't there, in British cinema? And Films and Filming is the magazine that's remembered as a kind of covert gay porn magazine masquerading as kind of empire for film goers of the 1970s. There was always like a nude man on the front. And in fact, there were interesting contact ads in it. And it was your May to December thing. It was often like elderly distinguished film fan seeks young film fan to exchange pictures of Gary Cooper. And,
Rock Hudson aficionado wanted for absolutely, yeah. I was also thinking that very early, one of the first moving pictures of the naked man running and jumping, and I mean, that's not exactly gay porn. It's the male nude, but it's an interesting, and you've got people in the 80s like Derek Jarman, of course. And William Friedkin with Cruising as well, going into the culture of gay clubs and using it more sociologically. But I think that picture, Cruising, stands up as a sort of sociological sort of portrait, although it was very controversial at the time it was made.
Yeah, I think now it's remembered as a very important film, an absolute insight. And people are regretful that it didn't actually shoot in clubs like the Mine Shaft, and it didn't document the time a bit more with cinema verite than it did. But plenty of the US porn that now is beginning to emerge did actually do some of those things. And also cinemas in the US were kind of cruising grounds as well, so that the price of the ticket that you would pay would also be a kind of access to casual sex as well. I think in the UK, it would be more that you would go to Hampstead Heath or something like that after seeing a Fassbinder film in The Everyman in Hampstead or something like that. These two things were somewhat disconnected.
I love Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver taking Sybil Shepherd to a porn theatre and thinking that was like, I go to these all the time. What's the problem?
There was a bit of that going on there. Deep Throat was a kind of cause celeb and dinner party conversation and things like that. There was a moment, and Fred Houston attempted to make a very mainstream gay hardcore porn film as well, which didn't work and financially, commercially. But there was a moment when it seemed to be happening. But then it fell under the bus of 1980s moral backlash, Reagan and Thatcher, and the sense as well that people could possess films. They would no longer have to buy membership to a Soho cinema club, which were constantly being raided by the police, by the way. So if you were a teacher or a doctor and you were found in there, your name could appear in the newspaper, it could endanger your job, it could embarrass you, family problems, all these kinds of things would occur. I did a book that came out last year, which I did with a couple of colleagues, called Adult Themes, that was on the X certificate in the UK in the 60s and 70s. We really questioned the lack of gay material, commercial even gay material at that point. And we found that Jarman was obviously very important. But I mean, Jarman had been harassed by the police at the point of Sebastian being shown. And it wasn't really until the film Nighthawks was released that you really had a non-tangential, non-Charles Hawtrey style embrace of serious gay subject matter, with a couple of honorable exceptions like Richard Burton in Villain. But when Nighthawks was released, which was about a gay teacher cruising, this was a deeply miserable film. I mean, constantly raining, night, trouble from other people. And it came out at the point of disco, which in those early years was a great happening gay culture. And suddenly it seemed that gay culture was about celebration, and Nighthawks was kind of out of step, but nonetheless an incredibly important film. I in Adult Themes, my co-editors and I speculated that producers simply didn't have the taste or the desire to take a risk, and this would account for what seems to me to be quite a substantial lacuna in British 70s filmmaking, which is around serious engagements with gay subject matter. There isn't Kenneth Williams, there isn't demeaning, there isn't somebody committing suicide or dying early, but is looking at a very important part of society at that point.
They probably thought there wasn't an infrastructure, in the sense that although there'd be an audience, that a lot of cinemas wouldn't necessarily show it, and they might have further problems in that, financial ultimately. I would also point to the little scene filmed Staircase with Richard Burton and Rex Harrison, which is Stanley Donen directed. It's not a widely known film, but it's a bit dour. It has to be said. It is a little bit dour, but it is a comedy apparently.
Yeah, that's right. And there were a number of gay pressure groups that made their own films that were designed to be shown, I guess, church halls, meetings, GLC, stuff like that. So there's clearly an understanding of a lack of representation. But I mean, James Berman, who was a great liberalizing leader of the British Board of Film Classification, never really got over his, I guess, homophobia. And they really wanted stuff cut out. In Villain, which I just mentioned, for example, stuff in gay clubs or those kinds of things. And he was perpetually coming out with notes around, psychiatrists have informed us about this, or, mutilated, strangled bodies found outside gay clubs. We really can't be encouraging gay subcultures. So this was almost the, as it were, the horizon of what was possible, despite the fact that you're talking about legal activity after 1967. Despite that, British cinema was reluctant to embrace it. One exception for me is very important, is John Schlesinger's film Sunday Bloody Sunday.
Right.
And I find that film quite extraordinary. And I know that James Berman, who was a big fan of Schlesinger, gave him carte blanche at the point of discussing the film before it was shot. Make what you want. After Midnight Cowboy, I trust you to do what you want. And there's stuff in that film that seems very particular to the early 1970s, to certain cultures around the meat rack, which was Piccadilly Circus, gay rent boy cultures, stuff going on, interaction as well between the protagonist, who's a very respectable family doctor, and a male cowboy, and all kinds of things which strike me as way ahead of the time. So, yeah, Sunday Bloody Sunday, I would call out for special praise in respect of one of the few British films that really deals with that culture.
Excellent. Well, Ben, could I ask you for a film book recommendation for us to close out our conversation?
A film book recommendation, I think I can give you one straight off. When I was writing Hotbeds of Licentiousness, as luck would have it, Jingan Young was also writing a book for the same publisher, Berghain Film, and it was on something quite similar. And that book was called Soho on Screen, Cinematic Spaces of Bohemia and Cosmopolitanism, 1948 to 1963. And this book, Soho on Screen, really explores some of the things I was talking about earlier. Soho is this fascinating liminal zone, this place of immigration, of new cultures, of new freedoms, the place that is the petri dish for the coming society, and how cinema really began to document that in all kinds of exploitational films of that moment that now, we love to see with nostalgia. So Soho on Screen, that's the book I recommend.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Ben, for joining me. It was a brilliant conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, John. Love talking to you.
1-800-Flowers.com knows that a gift is never just a gift. A gift is an expression of everything you feel and helps build more meaningful relationships. 1-800-Flowers takes the pressure off by helping you navigate life's important moments by making it simple to find the perfect gift. From flowers and cookies to cake and chocolate, 1-800-Flowers helps guide you in finding the right gift to say how you feel. To learn more, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.